And welcome back. We're going to start a little bit early on this talk, just so we can try and fit in a few questions. So this is Sarah Young, and she's going to be telling you how to lose your container in 10 days? No, minutes. Sorry, I'm not hip with the references.
Okay, cool. I've turned on my mic pack thing, so that's a good start. So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Eliza said, my name's Sarah Young. As you can see, I'm a queen of photoshopping, or as someone asked me just then, it's not actually Photoshop, it's Paint. Yeah, I know, it's great, isn't it? If you haven't, by the way, no prior knowledge of this movie is required for this talk. It's just me trying to be clever, and not really that clever, but hey. And if you don't know the premise of the movie, just in case you want to, basically Kate Hudson, I forget her name in the movie, she's a journalist, and she decides that she's going to try and make all the common dating mistakes that women make to see if she can get rid of a guy in 10 days. So I thought that for my talk and for my experiment, I would see how quickly I could lose a container and do all the mistakes that people make when, security-based mistakes that people make when configuring containers. So yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about. So who am I? I work for this small company. You might have heard of them, I don't know. They're a small startup. If you like stickers, I've got loads at the end, so come see me. Unless you're a Microsoft hater, then don't. Or unless you want to wind people up, I get that a lot. You know, hey, my colleague hates Microsoft. Can I have a sticker? It's okay with me. My name's Sarah Young. I actually live in Melbourne. I am originally from the UK. I've worked in Europe and New Zealand and all over the place. I don't spend a lot of time in Melbourne. I travel a lot. I've worked in tech for the last 10 years or so, and I overuse memes and GIFs, or GIFs, in my presentations. We won't go there, but whether or not you think it's filler or you think it's meaningful, I'll let you decide. Usually people seem to think they're okay, but yeah, we'll go with it. This slide is out of date. So this is actually my job title. It is Azure Cloud Security and Compliance Global Black Belt. In fact, so yeah, I don't know. Like, I literally tell people I fight hackers because it's funny. I don't. I'm full-on blue teamer. And in fact, my job title changed at the beginning of the month. I'm now, hang on, Advanced Security Architecture Global Black Belt. Basically, my job hasn't changed, just my job title, so I don't know. Last word of caution, please don't Google me, or Google me with caution, I should say, because Sarah Young is a fairly common name. You'll get Sarah Young, the Christian author, not so bad. I actually found one of her books when I was in Hawaii last year. But there's also Sarah Young, the late 80s porn star. I'm not joking, so like really do Google that with caution, especially if you're using Work Machine. So I kind of said what I was going to talk about today. We're going to talk about container security and a bit of orchestrator security as well. Largely, when I talk about orchestrators, I'm going to talk about Kubernetes because I like Kubernetes, and in my opinion, it will become soon enough the de facto orchestration tool. Okay. So we're going to talk about good security practices for containers and Kubernetes and some of the related tools. There's my screen gone. That's okay. I can keep talking. It's all good. Is it coming back? Is it coming back? Oh. It's actually appropriate, right? Like. Let's try that again. Cool. Sweet. Additional challenge. Achievement unlocked. Root fixed laptop during talk. I'm going to talk about, to start with, all the good things you should do with containers and orchestrators from a security perspective. And then we'll talk about my little experiment where I genuinely thought, before I wrote this talk, that I could actually get containers owned within like 10 minutes. I thought that is really easy. Turns out it's not. Now, my other idea was that I would actually spin up a container before a talk and then give everyone the details, and then they could bash it, and by the end of the talk it would definitely be owned. But I also felt that was kind of unfair and defeated the object of the experiment, so we're not doing that. But I've broken this down into a couple of sections. We're going to talk about protecting your data, caring for your OS and your orchestrator, checking privilege, shifting left with containers, and then at the end I'll talk about getting my containers owned. So this pretty much sums up container and Kubernetes security for me. So it's not just emojis. Well, it is emojis, and it's not monkeys. It is see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. So what I see a lot with container and orchestrated security is people are like, hey, this is just security. We'll just do it the same way we do our we do application security at the moment in our traditional monolithic stack. No, very bad. But people think, hey, we've got a tool that's been working for the last 10 years to monitor applications. We'll just keep using it. What could go wrong? Many things, actually, many things. So let's talk about good data protection practices. Now, this is something you're going to have heard from every single security person in the planet ever. So I apologize that I should be telling you stuff you've heard before and should be common sense, but you'd be surprised how many times people don't do it. But this is something that's really, really important, which is our hygiene. So in the words of Mary Poppins, and I think it comes from something else, but well begun is half done. Like, you need to do your application right to start with. You need to make it of high quality and good security things. Because what we find is usually when you're doing containers and you're deciding to orchestrate things, you're often moving to the cloud at the same time. Now, I don't care which cloud you move to, Microsoft, but like I don't care which cloud you move to, those principles remain the same. Genuinely, they do. But so I will end up talking quite a bit about cloud as well, because generally these things go hand in hand. Now, I know that it is possible to run containers in an on-prem environment, but I think this usually goes with a shift to the cloud at the moment. So if you're making the move to the cloud, please tidy up your application. If it's using Telnet, if it's using SSL, please fix that stuff before you move it up, because if you have crap on-prem, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, and you move it into the cloud, it's just as bad there. It's not actually improving those layers of your stack. And so it's really important to do this. And I know that often when you're doing migration projects, people will say, oh, but we don't have the bandwidth to do that. It's not part of our budget, blah, 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 blah. It's not in scope. But someone's got to do it at some point. And if you're actually making this massive shift to containerize things, put things in microservices, and move into the cloud, this is a really good time to do it. So please do. Moving on from that, we're going to talk about the shared responsibility model, because this really goes into the moving to the cloud. Anyone heard of shared responsibility model from any cloud provider? Oh, good. Everyone reckon they understand it properly? Yeah, cool. That's what most people say. No shame in that. So when we move to the cloud, something that's really important from a security perspective is understanding the shared responsibility model. What that is understanding which security controls your cloud provider provides and which security controls you need to do. And depending on precisely what you're doing in the cloud actually changes what security controls are done by whom. So this is a cool analogy that one of my colleagues did. I have to give credit to him because I'm not smart enough to think of that stuff. But if we take software as a service, that's like a hotel room. Everything's done for you, gets cleaned once a day, et cetera, and all you do is bring in your clothes and sleep there. Platform as a service is more like a furnished apartment. So you're getting your furniture, you're getting the apartment, and it might get cleaned once a week, but you need to bring in the food, et cetera, and do all of those things. Infrastructure as a service is more like a rental apartment. So you're just getting the bare apartment, you need to furnish it, you need to pay the bills, et cetera. And private cloud's like a house, as in you do everything. Everything is your problem. I like that analogy. There are other ones out there. There's like a pizza one, but I can't remember that one off the top of my head. But this is important because we're moving away from this traditional security model. It's a castle. I know everyone uses a castle. Do people know what I mean when we say traditional security model? As in we have a big perimeter with lots of firewalls and it's all in our data center. That's our traditional security model. But now we're moving, when we do cloud and we containerize things, into zero trust. Zero trust was something that was put out by some Forrester analyst a while ago, and it means verify the person, verify the device, and verify your access scenarios. So it doesn't mean that we just use firewalls and this big perimeter wall to protect everything, because now we have BYOD, we have IoT, we have all of those different things that mean we're not containing our assets within the data center anymore. I wanted to find like a quote on isolation, and this is the only thing I could find. Obviously, clearly Jimmy Page was talking about cloud security when he made this quote. But when we move into the cloud, it's important that everything just doesn't trust everything else, and that's zero trust. So inherently, this machine cannot talk to this machine. You have to explicitly allow everything. So it means that if someone breached your external perimeter, which is still there, it's still going to make it really difficult for them to move between things. Really important that you understand this. It's even for a cloud infrastructure perspective, but also from an application perspective, because it also applies to when we containerize things and when we break things up into microservices. So, caring for your OS and orchestrator. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk a lot about Kubernetes, but you can replace the word Kubernetes with pretty much any other orchestrator as well. First and foremost, and if there's one thing that you should care about when you're doing a container, if there's one security control you can do, can you please make sure you know where your container images come from. We know you can get container images all over the place. You can get them from GitHub, you can get them from the Docker Hub, etc. But make sure you know where they come from and you've checked them for rubbish, because there was there's some compromised images on the Docker Hub website, and they got downloaded something like 350,000 times before they got removed, and they had Bitcoin miner in them, I think. Might have been Bitcoin miner. There was some kind of malware anyway. And if if you're using a container image that's got some kind of malware or something nasty in it, like, it's game over before you've even looked at any other security controls. So it's important that you pull a base image, sanitize it, make sure it's got all your security tooling in it, that it's not got any rubbish in it, and then store it in a private image repository. So there's Claire, there's Notary, all the big cloud platforms have their own container image repository as well that you can use. All of those things are important because you don't want nasty surprises, right? So, yeah. So once a lady told me when I gave this talk that she found this GIF upsetting, so I'm not sure why. I thought it was funny. But if anyone does find it upsetting, I apologize. As you can see, I haven't actually changed the pictures since then. So the fault and default. So I'm going to pick on Kubernetes here, but I could totally pick on Rancher as well if I felt like it. So Kubernetes default configs aren't too secure. It is getting better. I think we're on version 1.15 now, but some of the earlier versions, which you may well be using, had some terrible defaults. Like, so some notable, interesting ones were that the API server used to listen on port 8080, and there was literally no authorization. It could just chat to anything. And the secrets management was done in etcd. Interesting. The Center for Internet Security, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a non-profit organization that releases a lot of different benchmarks, not just for Kubernetes, for different OSs and other products. It gives you a benchmark of how you can configure things securely. So if it's something that's new to your organization, you should use those because they are free. The first time I ever did this talk was in Seattle, and I like Frasier, so I put Frasier in there. Like, sometimes I feel I need to explain some of these because people probably don't think the same way I do, which you can only be grateful for, I promise. Yeah, if you're a Zelda fan, you may understand that one. Right, don't bake your creds and secrets into containers. This is the modern equivalent of having a config file sat on your desktop or whatever. They should be passed into containers as environment variables. As I said before, Kubernetes, some of the older versions anyway, stores secrets by default in etcd, encoded in base 64. Yeah, I know. Like, it's just, I know this is really old now, but this was my favorite version of this meme I ever saw, and I will use it in this talk until I die. So all the major cloud providers have secrets management platforms that you can use. I would, if you're using one of the big cloud providers and they have a native secrets key management solution, just use that for ease of use. I know that there are some particular circumstances where that won't work. If that's the case, then sure, go look at a third-party one. And something that we don't talk about enough is rotating your keys regularly. Okay, all keys should be rotated in the cloud. Now, how regularly you want to rotate them will depend on your risk posture and all of that kind of stuff. I'd leave that to some risk people to work out how regularly they want to do it. But please, please, please make sure that you build in the capability to do that. Because even if you decide not to rotate them regularly, which I don't recommend, if you have an emergency situation where your keys get leaked, you want to already have a system to try and do that automatically and quickly. I'm going to move on to my horror stories. I have 3. I have to be very vague. They come from a previous employer, and I can't reveal precisely what organization it was. But these are all real things I have seen in real life. There was a dev who wanted a slightly different container image, so they just decided they'd pull it from a public repository. Any guesses what happened next? Yes. Yeah, it did. The horror story thing is just, that was just, yeah. Bitcoin miner, obviously. There's a lot of Bitcoin miner out there. We know it's a nice, easy one to do. But I mean, luckily it was picked up in about 12 hours, so they didn't find out via a bill, which is probably the worst way to find out you've got Bitcoin miner in your environment. But yeah. So checking your privilege. Again, something you'll have heard about. I know, I think I'm clever. I'm like, for containers, you'll have heard this many times, I'm sure. Don't run as root, don't run as root, please don't run as root. I couldn't think of anything for root, so I was like, Groot. I know, bad jokes. But if I know there are still some specific circumstances where you need to run as root, but in general now, you do not need to run containers as root. Please do not do it. I know that sometimes it makes the development a little bit harder, but really, there's about 5 circumstances in which it is necessary, and if it is not one of those, you should not be doing it. Also, you should be looking, if you are running as root, at using runtime security tools. Now, there's a ton of them out there, so some honorable mentions go to Aqua Enforcer, there's SE Linux, AppArmor, and SecComp. I'm not sort of telling you which one you should use, just go and have a look at them and see which one works. Ideally, you should be using runtime security tools also on your running as root containers, the ones that aren't running as privilege. But you know, if you can only do it in a limited fashion, then please at least start with your ones where your containers are running as root. It really does mitigate your risk and lower that blast radius if someone did compromise a container. Then talking about orchestrators, I had absolutely nothing to put on this slide, so I went with Clippy. I have stickers of him if anyone wants one at the end. I know, I totally heard a yay. As I said before, Kubernetes has got some terrible defaults in some of the older versions. Like the dashboard had full admin privileges, literally the web interface to it. It had no RBAC. If you're not familiar with the acronym, that's role-based access control before version 1.8. If this all sounds too onerous to do yourself, especially if you're just coming up with, coming up to doing microservices and containers, and it's fairly new to your organization, there's no shame in looking at using a managed Kubernetes cluster. Again, all the big cloud providers have them. Just go and have a look at them. I've often found that a lot of engineering teams want to build their own clusters just because they want to say they did. And Kubernetes is really easy to spin up, but really difficult to get right, not just from a security perspective. So I would really recommend looking at managed Kubernetes clusters. And horror story number 2 is I saw a Kubernetes cluster that was spun up just for a play around with some bad defaults. It was left exposed to the internet. Any guesses what happened next? Yes! Yes, it was Bitcoin miner. I realize that when I tell these stories, it's basically Bitcoin miner, Bitcoin miner, Bitcoin miner. And we know that there are other terrible things that can happen. This is actually probably the least impactful thing. I mean, you should be glad if you just get a Bitcoin miner, but hey. So, last but not least, we will talk about containing your enthusiasm for shifting left. So, we've all heard the buzzwords, let's shift left, let's do DevOps, let's be agile, etc. Now, it's really important that I hate buzzwords, but it is important to think about these things because when you start to containerize things, when you're using orchestrators, remember that your traditional application security toolset may not be appropriate anymore because a lot of things need to be specifically container aware, otherwise they don't see anything. So when I'm talking about security tools, I'm talking about things like IDS and heuristics, vulnerability scanning, SIEM, runtime security, which we've already talked about, and if you've got any auditing tools. So, it's really important that you actually have a look to see if your tools are still going to work. If you're creating a CI/CD pipeline at the same time, which is great if you're going from scratch, you also need to look at altering your tools to work in the pipeline, and you may need to replace them entirely. If you're going from scratch, this is probably a lot easier because you can just, do your research and see what works for your organization. But you do need to spend some time thinking about this because you absolutely cannot assume that what worked in your monolithic application stack is going to work in cloud native and containerized environments, because it's probably not, at least not without some modifications. And then finally, actually go and benchmark your tools, like really. You should have developers and security involved in this process, because if security just pick a tool and the devs don't like it, they won't use it, and vice versa. I know, like, we've got to be working together here, I know. Like this. I know. It's beautiful, I know. And I know, and it does all align in with this whole shifting left and people working together, and there being more of an amalgamation of, devs doing a bit more security, security understanding more about devs. And I know it's cheesy, but like, it really does work a lot better if we do it this way, I promise. And then last but not least, my horror story number 3 is that I saw an organization try to use an old school vulnerability scanner on their containers. So unsurprisingly, those results weren't very useful. They told me that the vulnerability scanner found nothing and everything was fine. Yeah, no. Don't think it could see anything, but I actually replaced this with this, the Trump shutdown and all the McDonald's picture, because I thought that was an even better fail picture, but there you go. And finally, my little experiment that I did, I wanted to see if I could get things owned, because I thought this could be really, really easy. So what I've been doing is I've been spinning up containers and Kubernetes clusters and leaving them open to the internet for quite a while now, and it's costing me quite a lot of money. I spun them up on a cloud hosting provider, not Azure, and it's actually not. I won't say who it was. I used one where I could pay through PayPal, so I didn't have to give them my credit card because I was too scared. And I tried to do the opposite of everything I've just encouraged you to do. So, I wanted to get the hackers in. Feel free to use this in your security presentations. It's amazing. Yeah. So, anybody want to guess what kind of containers would be good to spin up that would definitely get owned if I left them open to the internet? Any guesses? Jenkins, nice. Yes. Any others? Confluence. Oh, I didn't do that one. Yeah. They're good. Well, my main ones, my favorite were WordPress and Ubuntu, but specifically Ubuntu 14.04, because that one's full of holes. And yeah, I also tried some Kubernetes clusters as well. So yeah, it was interesting. But what actually happened? Well, sadly, not as much as I would have expected. Now, definitely not in 10 minutes. And I think this was because I was using a cloud hosting provider, and although I reverse engineered a lot of the firewall rules and opened everything up, I still think that possibly there was some other protection in there that I couldn't see on the cloud hosting provider, but hey. But interestingly, the wonderful Atticus, who is, of course, the chair of PyCon AU, did tweet this a while ago, saying that it took a month before a WordPress site that she had spun up actually had a sustained hacking attempt. And so that made me feel a whole lot better that I couldn't manage to get something hacked. Although I am a security person, so maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so that made me feel slightly better. But what I did do was, as I said, it was very interesting and very strange as a security person to have to reverse engineer all these firewall rules and open them up. Very strange, feels weird, let me tell you. But it was an interesting experiment. I also used a tool called, I don't know if you pronounce it PSAD or PSAD. It's an open source tool that basically runs on IP tables in Linux, and it looks at any kind of port scans that happened. So I was having a look at this because I was doing this on the cheap. It's actually cost quite a lot of money in the end, but in theory I was doing it on the cheap. And there are some interesting things that come up. What was interesting is all these lookup, the who is things are apparently being used for adverts. Did people know this? So we have obviously some scans from China. We've got black host networks. Take advantage of loads of bandwidth. And I was like, okay, cool. That's clearly being used for bad things. This was my favorite one, security trouble from Alibaba. This is real. God knows. And yeah, so it was interesting, and we saw some attempts at SQL injection, etc. So although maybe I didn't get everything totally owned, and possibly, I don't like to admit it, but maybe they had been owned and I just couldn't tell. Obviously that wasn't it. Who knows? But in conclusion, please tidy up your application before you do your cloud migration. or you containerize things, please, please do that. Security hygiene is so important. And it's all well and good talking about all these extra tools and firewalls and seams and scanners, but then people don't patch and things like that. And, you know, we've got to get the basics right. And people overlook it so often, it's painful. Orchestrated defaults are terrible, so change them. Or even better, if you don't understand orchestrators, or it's still something you're getting up to speed on, just use something managed. Please, 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 please make sure you know where your container images come from. Just please. Don't run as root unless you have like really good reasons. One of those like 5 reasons for doing so. Keep your secrets secret. Like, do actually put them in a proper secrets storage place. Make sure that people only have the access they should to it, etc. Shift left, but make sure you've got the right tools to support doing this. And then last but not least, and this is probably the wrong note to end on, but purposely trying to get containers hacked is apparently harder than one would expect. That's not official, that's not canon. Please never quote me on that, despite the fact I've just put it up on a screen. And there's a couple of useful links here. There's the Center for Internet Security Kubernetes Security Benchmark. There's the Docker Security Benchmark from Center for Internet Security. Also, there's the NIST special publication 800-190. So if you've ever read NIST publications, they are incredibly long and usually mind-numbingly boring. This one is about 10 pages long, and it's about container security. It's really quite accessible, so I recommend having a read of it. Liz Rice, who works for Aqua Security, and Michael Hausenblas, who works for now AWS, they wrote a book on Kubernetes security. It's less than a year old, so it's pretty up to date, and they pretty much walk you through step by step how you can configure a Kubernetes cluster securely. You can get it for free as a PDF online, so definitely have a look at that. Of course, Microsoft have got some stuff on Kubernetes security. We talk a lot about Azure on there and AKS, but to be honest with you, the principles are the same for most things, so it's worth looking at. And then that cool tool called PSAD or PSAD, however it's pronounced, is created by a guy called Michael Rash, and you can download it there. Yeah, and that is me done. I didn't click the final clicker, but yeah, happy to take any questions, or you can just tweet me, whatever. And thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. Thanks.
Awesome. Whew, awesome. Now that works. So we've got some time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have any burning questions? Yeah?
Hi. So Kubernetes, you're saying that the defaults are really bad security-wise. Since this is quite well known, why do you think that might be that?
You know,
just defaults
it's
are so
a
bad
good question. I think the thing is, because obviously, I'm sure, just in case anybody in here doesn't know the background of Kubernetes, it was a Google project and then it went open source and now anyone can contribute to it. I think that with a lot of open source projects, and I think they've acknowledged quite recently, only recently-ish, that this is a problem, is that generally people who contribute to open source projects are very more development focused and they just don't think about it. It's not a good reason, but I think that's what it is. I know that literally in the last month, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, who now oversee all the kind of Kubernetes and Kubernetes related projects, they've now created like a security focus group, and they're going to be doing actual conferences and making sure there's more work done on that. So I think it will change, but I think at the beginning with these open source projects, it's just feature functionality, and security is definitely not at the top of the agenda.
I know I worked for a company once who thought, if we set stupid values, people will change them. That obviously worked real well. Any other questions? Oh, why are you on the opposite side of the room to me?
Hi. What are your feelings on configuration management within containers to speed up response to security issues?
What, by configuration management within containers?
Yeah, good question. We do that. My company does that. We have configuration management within containers to allow us to do things like, and you talked, there was a talk in here earlier about using etcd to distribute keys. Mm-hmm. Is there an expectation that, for example, you might want to change some configuration without restarting containers? Do you do anything like that?
I don't in general. I mean, obviously, there's so many things you can put in a container. I'm of the opinion that if you need to change something in a container, they should be ephemeral and you should blow it away and redeploy it. Like, you shouldn't, it sort of breaks the whole concept of containers and the cloud native type computing thing. I have heard of a couple of examples of when it's necessary. I often find it's normally when people have tried to shoehorn a very old application into a container where it doesn't really, it just won't really tolerate being blown away and built back up. But I think I don't think we should be, I don't envisage that being developed massively because it kind of goes against the grain for what containerization is. But I'm not saying that people don't do it. I just don't think we'll see much development in kind of tooling, but I realize that there will be people who have that in their environments. It's damn old applications, right?
We have time for one more. Oh.
Hi, just building on that, if I made that question a little bit more concrete,
Okay.
and talk about something like, imagine you have a very large fleet of like web servers, maybe like 100,000 or some very, very, very large number, and there's some kind of security issue, and you might be using something like Chef or Ansible or something like that within your containers to control some certain things and allow some limited amount of like updating or something like that. It might be faster to update or patch something in line rather than having to kind of like redeploy. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on the tensions between those two things?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's very context specific in general. I would still always advocate blowing away, but if you were orchestrating stuff, I think you might do more like a scheduled blowing away, as in you wouldn't like go kill the lot. You do it in batches, because Kubernetes and orchestrators are good for doing things like that. But then you've also got the problem if it's a security incident, like, do you have time to wait to do it in that manner? And there's also a question around the whole ephemeral nature of containers. If you want to do security forensics, how does that work if your answer is just to blow it away? I don't have answers to that. I think it's still very much in its infancy, the kind of best practice and thinking around that. And yeah, I don't know, particularly around the forensics bit, because yeah, if your answer is blow it away, and yeah, I don't have, I think at the moment, because we have no accepted best practices, I think, I hate this phrase, but you do you. Like you kind of have to probably work it out for yourself as a business. I think in a few years, we'll get more concrete thinking on what's best to do there. We're just not there yet.
Right, thanks.
Thanks again to Sarah. You're allowed to clap.
Yeah.
We'll be taking a break.